Luke chapter 19, verse 45 through chapter 20, verse 19. And he, that is Jesus, went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein and them that bought, saying unto them, It is written, My house is the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Those statements are from Isaiah and Jeremiah. And Jesus taught daily in the temple. But the chief priest and the scribes and the chief of the people sought to destroy him, and could not find what they might do. For all the people were very attentive to hear him. And it came to pass that on one of those days, as he taught in the people in the temple, and preached the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes came upon him with the elders, and spake unto him, saying, Tell us, by what authority doest thou these things? Or who is he that gave thee this authority? And he answered and said unto them, I also will ask you one thing, and answer me. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or of men? They reasoned with themselves, saying, If we shall say from heaven, he will say, Why then believed ye not him? But if we say of men, all the people will stone us, for they be persuaded that John was a prophet. And they answered that they could not tell whence it was. And Jesus said unto them, Neither tell I you, by what authority I do these things. Then began he to speak to the people this parable. A certain man planted a vineyard, and led it forth to husbandmen, and went into a far country for a long time. And at the season he sent a servant to the husbandmen, that they should give him of the fruit of the vineyard. But the husbandmen beat him, and sent him away empty. And again he sent another servant, and they beat him also, and entreated him shamefully, and sent him away empty. And again he sent a third, and they wounded him also, and cast him out. Then said the Lord of the vineyard, What shall I do? I will send my beloved Son. It may be they will reverence him when they see him. But when the husbandmen saw him, they reasoned among themselves, saying, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance may be ours. So they cast him out of the vineyard, and killed him. What therefore shall the Lord of the vineyard do unto them? He shall come and destroy these husbandmen, and shall give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, that is, the crowd around, said these words, God forbid. And he beheld them and said, that is, Jesus beheld the crowd, and said, What is this then that is written? The stone, which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. And the chief priests and the scribes, the same hour, sought to lay hands on him, and they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. Let's pray. Luke chapter 19, as we read, over the next 4 weeks, we are going to have a mini-series of sorts, if you will. From the end of chapter 19 to the beginning of chapter 21, there are 3 primary questions that are asked to Jesus. And so we'll have a mini-series called Question and Answer with Jesus. The final of those 4 will be a question from Jesus. Not from the opposition, but from Jesus himself. And the question we have presented to us today is this question: Who gave you this authority? Where did you get this authority? Have you heard about Dave from corporate? Anybody hear about Dave from corporate, aside from my kids that heard it earlier? Dave wanted to try an experiment one day, and so he walked into Walmart, having dressed up in a dress shirt and a tie, got himself a clipboard, a pen, and some papers, and he walked into Walmart and just started, walking around the stores, looking at shelves, writing some stuff down, and finally he saw some employees and told them, hey, you need to fix this display right here, and you need to get this organized, and this is not right, and all these kind of just various little things, and everybody just assumed, oh, he must be from corporate. Some of them called their supervisors and said, hey, did you know that we were having a surprise visit? And none of the supervisors had any idea Dave from corporate was coming, but whatever. Maybe the funniest part is Dave went to the break room and held a team meeting with everybody and gave a pep talk about boosting sales, improving morale, and customer satisfaction. And finally, however, somebody got suspicious enough and called the store manager, the one who would know whether or not someone from corporate was supposed to come. And the store manager arrived and he asked Dave, he said, who are you? Dave confidently replied, I'm Dave from corporate. The manager responded, corporate who? Corporate who? And Dave stopped for a moment and looked at him and said, you know what? I think I'm in the wrong store. Took his clipboard and everything and walked on out before any security or police or anybody got there. Here was Dave's experiment. Can I get away with pretending I have authority over all the employees of Walmart and be in charge of them and give them commands and all this stuff without them realizing I'm just some random guy that walked in off the street and started ordering them around? For a while he got away with it until he got called out by the person that did have authority. The event that begins our passage today is somewhat similar, obviously not a 1-to-1 ratio, that's for sure. But Jesus is anything but pretending to be in authority. If anything, it's the opposite direction, that the religious leaders were pretending they had authority when Jesus comes in and says, no, I'm the one who has the authority. And he cleans out the temple. Look at verse 45 again. And he went into the temple and began to cast them out that sold therein, and them that bought, saying unto them, it is written, my house is the house of prayer. But ye have made it a den of thieves. The temple, where all these things were taking place, had become a far cry from what God had intended it to be. Recall with me again that Jerusalem, the area around Jerusalem, has become flooded with pilgrims coming into town to celebrate the Passover. And what had been instituted along the way is the chief religious authorities gave permission to certain people that instead of me going out and raising lambs and making sure I bring a perfect spotless lamb or the equivalent for those that couldn't raise a lamb and there were birds that they could offer and certain things. Anyway, rather than I doing that, or me doing that, they set up a system where certain people would just raise all these animals and make sure they had all these animals. And so all those pilgrims coming from far away, when you're coming from Galilee, you don't have to bring your own animal. You just come and then you can buy an animal to sacrifice right there. It was a system of ease, and best I understand from Scripture, the problem wasn't that system was forbidden. I couldn't find any Scripture where it was forbidden that people could just buy the animal that they were supposed to get or supposed to sacrifice. The problems that arose, however, were from the implementation of that system. So the system, while it makes sense and seems logical to begin with, as it went on, it became something that it was never intended to be at the beginning. First problem was this: it became a way of making exorbitant profits. The people that ran this business and sold these animals, it would have been one thing if they did so and they made a little bit of profit to support their families and their business and that kind of thing, like we would do today. There would be one thing in that. But what they began to do is they began to sell these animals because they knew, hey, these people are coming. They don't have a choice. They have to have an animal for Passover. And so we can charge whatever we want to charge them, and they have to pay it. And thus they began to line their pockets off the backs of people that were very, very poor. Another issue that arose is there became a fixation among some that, well, you got to have the right coinage to buy these things. So suppose you come from Galilee, you have your own coins up there in Galilee, but here in Jerusalem we use this coin, and so you need to go to the money changers and you need to exchange your Galilean money for our Jerusalem money and then come pay us in our Jerusalem money. And oh, by the way, those guys are going to charge you an arm and a leg to exchange rate of your money. Terrible. Absolutely it does. It's terrible. Now, the problem that Jesus addresses is that the court of the Gentiles, which would be the large area around the temple, so the Temple Mount is one, but that big open area that kind of loops around in a U shape there, that is the court of the Gentiles. That place was a place where anyone from any tribe, anyone from any walk of life, any religious pursuit, any way, no matter who they were, Jew, Gentile, or anything, they could come to that court and they could worship God there. But the problem was that court became overflown with people, haggling prices, arguing, trying to get the best buck that they could for their money. Now, I'm sure you can also imagine how not only did this cause problems in that arena, but it also maybe disturbed family relationships a little bit. Last year, Wyatt and I went to a baseball game for the Rumble Ponies. I always think of them as the Binghamton Mets, but it's the Rumble Ponies. We went to that, and by the time we bought tickets, and we bought a couple hot dogs and bought some ice cream, and I don't remember what else we bought, popcorn or something like that, or cotton candy or who knows what. By the time we did all that, just the two of us, it was like $100. Just like that. And that's cheap compared to if you tried to go to a major league game. I've seen some pictures on what their prices are. It's ridiculous. Same thing. We went back in August or beginning of September to the New York State Fair. Cheap ticket to get in, but once you get in there, you want to buy anything, price through the roof. I mean, I don't know what the county fair is like, but I imagine it's not too much cheaper. Back in December, we looked at going to a movie at the AMC in Vestal. It was almost $100 just for tickets for all of us. Not to mention if we wanted to buy popcorn or water, I mean, you're going to charge you $10 just for basically this amount of water. They want to charge you $10 or whatever. What is it? Price gouging because they can. They've set the system up that they can charge those prices. My kids can probably attest to my grumbling about having to pay the exorbitant and ridiculous prices, I'm sure. Maybe you remember your dad or your husband or yourself grumbling about having to pay this and they're ripping us off and everybody knows they're ripping us off and nobody will do anything about it. Well, that's kind of how things were here. Everybody's getting ripped off and everybody knows it and nobody's doing anything about it, especially the religious leaders who are in charge and should have been doing something about it. Now, when you're being taken advantage of and everybody knows it, I'm sure you'll find it surprising that doesn't necessarily lend to a very worshipful attitude, does it? Doesn't.
The wrong direction.
Exactly, it's going opposite of direction. You're right. There is no desire when I know I'm being taken advantage of by whomever to worship God. Isaiah and Jeremiah both note the purpose for God's temple is so that people could come and worship God there. It'll be a house of prayer. Now, that large area of the court of the Gentiles that surrounds the temple proper, which the first entrance there would be the court of women, and then, of course, the Holy of Holies is farther back in there. That court, again, anyone could come to that court and worship. And yet instead of coming and being able to spend time praying and worshiping God in a serene and majestic environment, not that it wouldn't have been busy with a lot of people there and a lot of noise with a lot of people there, but it had simply become a cacophony of a business of thieves. Because that's what taking advantage of other people for your own personal gain is. Thievery. Maybe a present day example. Taking advantage of God's people who come to church to worship God, and instead the preacher's doing who knows what, and whatever ridiculous things that they're doing today. I just saw the video of a preacher in, I think it was South Africa, getting out of a couple $100,000 sports car to go into church and to lead these people to worship God. And you're looking at the ridiculous things that are going on in our world. And that's just a simple present day example of what was going on in Jesus' day. And I would not want to be in those shoes when Judgment Day comes. But with Jesus having wreaked havoc on this business, the week of the Passover no less, the religious leaders that have allowed this system and have profited from this system, because they were making their you can sell here, but you're going to pay us, and so corrupt from the top down. The mafia, yeah, exactly. I'm not saying anything about our government. But obviously these religious leaders are incensed about Jesus doing this and coming in and kicking out the money changers and kicking out all these people. The problem they ran into is, as is typical when someone with the authority to comes in and cleans up, the people are what? They're all cheering for Jesus because he saw what was wrong and he corrected that which was wrong. And so people are happy about it, the marginalized are happy about it, and the religious leaders want to get rid of Jesus, but they can't just get rid of him because then there's got some questions they're going to have to answer. And so what they resort to is I call it a battle of wits, if you will. What they need to do is they need to get Jesus to perjure himself in front of the people. That way the people reject him, and then they can reinstitute all their junk. And so thus comes the series of questions we're going to examine over the coming weeks. The first being this: who gave you this authority? Now, at the outset, I'm not opposed to that question. It would be wise of us to consider and to ask, by what authority are these things being done? The problem, of course, is that wasn't really the question they were asking, per se. Behind the scenes, there was that ulterior motive. We're just trying to trap Jesus in his word so that we can get rid of him. We don't really want to know the answer to this question. We just want Jesus gone. And so if Jesus were to answer this and say, oh, well, I'm doing this of my own authority, well, then they'll immediately charge him with blasphemy, on top of, hey, you accepted the people's worship as you came into town last week, or on Sunday, Palm Sunday. And so they add another charge of blasphemy, and then they can get rid of Jesus. But as his custom was, Jesus responded with a question of his own. And his question was about the origin or the authority of John's baptism. Who gave John the Baptist authority to do what he did? Now, I don't know why these guys have not learned from the previous Pharisees and Sadducees and etc. and all those that have brought Jesus question after question after question over the course of 3.5 years, and every single time they lost. And so I'm not sure why these guys didn't pick up on what was going on elsewhere, but they didn't. Yeah, and personally, I'm somewhat surprised that they didn't, come back like as kids. We would come back and be like, oh, I asked you first, so you answer my question, then I'll answer your question. But they huddle together, and they try to formulate an answer to Jesus' question. If we say John's baptism is from heaven, then Jesus is going to respond and say, well, if it's from heaven, then why didn't you obey John? Clearly he's from God and you disobeyed John. And so they've pushed themselves and trapped themselves into a corner. And so they say, well, if we say it's of men, then the people are going to stone us because the people are all persuaded that John is from heaven. And so between a rock and a hard place they are. And so what do they resort to? We don't know where it came from. We don't know. Well, sure they knew. They just wouldn't admit it. They chose instead to lie and say, we don't know where John's baptism came from, rather than tell the truth. See, the quandary that comes when you refuse to acknowledge the truth is rather impressive. They're backed into a corner, and they knew it. And if everything else that they had done and were in the process of doing and were presenting to the people as their religious authorities, if all that wasn't damning enough, the peek behind the curtain at their conversation between themselves is surprisingly damning. Because it reveals they knew John the Baptist was right. And though they were not persuaded by John the Baptist, they knew he was a prophet. And so they're faced with either we tell the truth that John baptized with the authority from heaven, from God, and face the obvious retort from God, Jesus, which is, well, why didn't you listen to him? Or we face the wrath of the people who are certain John was a prophet from God. They know the truth. All they need to do is step out and acknowledge the truth. But instead they choose to lie. They choose to uphold a system that is not true. Isn't that the same dilemma the world faces today? The evidence points to Jesus. Creation points to Jesus. The Bible points to Jesus. The testimony of the changed lives of people from generation after generation points to Jesus. The martyrs point to Jesus. And everything else points to Jesus. But each and every person is faced with the reality that they must choose. Will I relinquish everything? Will I risk losing everything to tell the truth? Or will I ignore it and uphold that which is not true? A lie. So their final answer is what? We don't know where his authority came from. Norval Geldenhuys said that in effect Jesus' response was this: if you do not recognize authority when you see it, no amount of arguing will convince you of it. Maybe remind you a little bit of what was said about the rich man and Lazarus. Except one were to rise from the dead, they're still not even going to believe it. James Edwards says it this way: Jesus brings his interrogators to a threshold that would lead them to the truth they claim to desire, but they refuse to cross the threshold. For they are guided more by self-interest than by truth. When victory is no longer in sight, they calculate how to minimize their losses by suspending judgment. Oh, we don't know. He goes on to say this: to those unwilling to commit themselves, Jesus commits not himself. Were their faith as small as a mustard seed, he would respond, truly I tell you. But without faith, he responds, neither will I tell you. And so Jesus says to them, I won't answer your question. However, I will tell you who I am. He turns to the crowd and he tells them that parable we read in verses 9 through 16. Now, I'm not going to read it again, but the parable is an allegory of the nation of Israel. The certain man that plants the vineyard is God. God planted a vineyard. In other words, God started the nation of Israel through Abraham. Now, God did not dwell among that nation. Rather, he dwelt where? In the far country, in heaven. Yet at various times, God sent servants to the nation, his servants being his prophets, and he sent them to the vine dressers, the husbandmen, the religious leaders that are supposed to be keeping watch over the nation, He sent them to them to request from the prophet, or request from the vine dressers, the fruit of the nation of Israel. In other words, bring me the evidence that shows this nation is obedient to me, God. But what happened? Time after time after time, the religious leaders rejected the prophets. And so because of this hard-hearted stubbornness of the caretakers, who in Jesus' day are known by terms such as Pharisees, lawyers, scribes, chief priests, Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, in response to their rejection of the prophets, God finally does what? He sends His beloved Son, Jesus. And with the arrival of the Son, the attitude of the religious leaders changed, but not for the better. See, they saw who Jesus was. They saw who He came from. They knew by what authority He did these things. They knew He was the Son of God, the Son of Man. And it forced them to make a decision. Are we going to bow to His authority, or are we going to reject Him? To show Him respect would mean that they would have to give up everything in their system. They would have to acknowledge, we've been doing things wrong, and reject it and believe Jesus. But instead, they choose not to do that. Instead, they do what? They choose, let's reject Him. We will kill Him so that we might keep our system, that we might receive the inheritance, if you will. And so we will thus see the soon death of Jesus on the cross as a result. James Edwards again. The conclusion that Jesus draws is unavoidable. Yet people find it unacceptable. Oops, sorry, I skipped ahead. I missed 2 paragraphs in my notes. That's not going to help anything. You're not going to know what that whole quote means if I don't go for the first part too. So what will God do in response? They're going to kill Jesus. What is God going to do in response according to the story? It says He will come and remove them. He will not remove the nation as a whole. The nation of Israel is not necessarily being judged for their rejection of it. He says in the parable, He's going to come and remove the husbandmen. The religious leaders are going to be removed. Those that were supposed to care for the people, that were supposed to care for the nation of Israel, those that were supposed to lead the people of Israel to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah when the Messiah arrived, they get removed because they refuse to acknowledge the Messiah. And the care of those people of God would be turned over to others. And like we understand that Jesus meant by this, that the apostles would take over the care, and of course then we understand the church would be presented, and of course we could get into all the minutia of all that, and then now we have what? The under-shepherds, the pastors, and the elders of the church. Now the question might be, how would He destroy them? History tells us that Jesus died, and 3 days later Jesus rose again. And that from the time that Jesus rose again to about 40 so years later, 70 AD, their religious power systematically got weaker and weaker and weaker. And then in 70 AD, the Romans invade Jerusalem. They obliterate the city. They destroy the temple. And within 100 years of that, these groups, Pharisees, scribes, lawyers, Sanhedrin, Sadducees, chief priests, are virtually non-existent and remain so today. And the people's response to this whole story is this: God forbid. In other words, certainly not. That's not going to come to pass. Now, James Edwards, the conclusion Jesus draws is unavoidable. Yet people find it unacceptable. That Israel's inheritance could not only be extended to Gentiles, but withdrawn from Israel, is abhorrent to Jesus' audience. Those who have been granted God's favor often think that no offense on their part could cause God to withdraw it. Maybe remind you of what they used to say. Oh, well, we're children of Abraham, so we'll get in. Jesus responds to them in verse 17. What is this then that was written? The stone which the builders rejected is the same, rejected. The same is become the head of the corner. That's a quote from Psalm 118, verse 22. The same psalm that just moments before that says, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," that they were quoting regarding Jesus the day before. Various descriptions have been given as to what the cornerstone is and where it is and whatnot, but a cornerstone, generally speaking, forms the bond between the two most important walls of the building. From it, all the lines of the building run. Length, breadth, and height are angled from that stone. If the stone is out of square, the entire building will become out of square. Thus, the stone is always cut with meticulous care and laid with special ceremony. In other words, it would be foolish to try and build a building without a proper cornerstone that is properly built, that you know is right and true, because if you try and build with any old stone, your building's going to end up all cattywampus and who knows what. But if you start with a cornerstone that is true and right, unless you make some big mistakes along the way, your building should be true and right. That is exactly, however, what the religious leaders were trying to do. They're trying to run the vineyard, keep the vineyard for themselves, while denying the son of the owner of the vineyard the authority of Jesus that was necessary for the vineyard in the first place. They're attempting to build a kingdom to themselves without the key ingredient to building a kingdom. And the reality of rejecting the stone, Jesus says in verse 18, is, whomsoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken, but whomsoever it shall fall, on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. And so they faced a difficult decision. Either we give up the system willingly and allow that system to be crushed and destroyed by the cornerstone, and we live, or we hold tightly onto the system and try and keep the system in place and thus be crushed along with the system. Two options. And they chose the first, or the latter. The way Jesus phrased this in chapter 17 was this: whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. There's a story that's told about the king of Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan. It's a story that helps illustrate how the keepers of the vineyard, the religious leaders in Jesus' day, how they should have responded to the authority of Jesus. One night in the early 1980s, the security force of King Hussein came to him and told him that about 75 Jordanian army officers were gathered together a short ways away in barracks, plotting the overthrow of his government. The security officers requested permission to surround the building and arrest all of them, but the king refused. Instead, he told them, "Bring me a helicopter." He climbed aboard the helicopter and was flown to the barracks where these conspirators were meeting. It's also said that the king told the pilot, he said this, "If you hear gunshots, fly away without me." Unarmed, the king enters the room where the plotters were, and he said to them this: "Gentlemen, it has come to my attention that you are meeting here tonight to finalize your plans to overthrow the government, take over the country, and install a military dictator. If you do this, the army will break apart and the country will be plunged into civil war. Tens of thousands of innocent people will die. There's no need for this. Here I am. Kill me and proceed. That way only one man will die." The room was silent. The men were stunned. And then one by one, these rebels, convicted in their hearts, began to rush to the king to kiss his hand and feet and pledge their loyalty to him. And yet, as we read in verse 19, at the end of Jesus' parable, the religious leaders' skills of perception were really, really good and fully lacking all at the same time. They were convicted because they understood he's talking about us. And yet, instead of acknowledging the truth and reality of his authority, what do? They go and huddle together and determine, we got to kill him. We must destroy him. And that's the place we will pick up next week. As with last week, here's a few lessons we might learn. Number one, don't make the same mistake the religious leaders made in rejecting Jesus. See the authority of Jesus, acknowledge his authority, bow to his authority, believe in Jesus, and you will be saved. Number two, don't try and build a church without the cornerstone. Sadly, as every week passes, there are more and more examples of churches, and this week it was a cathedral, that have rejected the cornerstone in favor of building their own religious system. And we would be the fools of the century to think that we can run this church and build this church better if we just got rid of the cornerstone, Jesus, and his teachings. We can make this something better. Don't reject the cornerstone. Number three, somewhat similar but definitely different. Don't reject that which is true in order to keep that which is temporary. Trying to keep a firm grasp, as the religious leaders did, on their system and refusing to let it go and let it be dismantled when the truth is revealed, to try and keep that which is going to be destroyed, it's a fool's errand. Number four, don't cause offense to God, lest he remove his hand of blessing. Continual rejection of the Son and the message of the Son will result in the removal of God's blessing. Now, I'll clarify, I'm not talking about the loss of salvation here. I'm talking about living life like the religious leaders did. Thinking, oh, God's on our side, we're the religious leaders of Israel. These are the full blessings of God. When the reality of the situation was what? God was against them. And God was actively working to remove them. And they thought, all is well, we're good. Let's pray.